Thanks, Paul. Welcome to Q&A. Here to answer your questions tonight, Assistant Minister for Treasury and Finance, Seselja. Former President of the Human Rights Commission, Gillian Triggs. Former Deputy Prime Minister in more stable times, John Anderson. Shadow Treasurer, Chris Bowen. And Policy Consultant, Parnell McGuinness. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio. Let's go straight to our first question. It's from June Ma.
My question's to Seselja. As a public supporter of Peter Dutton in the lead-up to the spill, you stated that you believed that he could connect with people in large parts of Australia. Yet polling suggested otherwise and does make the coup appear to be crazy to the public, especially as the coalition continues to lose ground in the polls. Is this the best explanation you can offer for disposing the former Prime Minister?
Seselja.
Well, thank you, June. I gave a far more detailed explanation than that, in fact, on the week of the leadership change. I, in fact, went on ABC with Lee Sales, one of the best in the business, and outlined the case for change. And fundamentally, my argument and the reason I came to the conclusion that I did was that we as a party and as a government had lost connection with a pretty significant chunk of our traditional supporter base. And it is fundamentally true that in politics that whilst there is a need to extend well beyond your base in order to be successful, you can't be successful without a strong supporter base. That is true in politics right across the world.
Was there any concrete evidence in polling or otherwise, Zed, that suggested that Peter Dutton would actually do better, be more appealing to voters than Malcolm Turnbull? Well,
look, there was a number of factors and I outlined it. And what I didn't do is cite a series of opinion polls. What I did do is cite areas of policy. And there is no doubt that when it came to a number of those policies, and I outlined a couple of them in some of those interviews, things like energy policy, one that I was particularly concerned about was issues around funding of non-government education, which I think we've now gotten right. That was a fundamental problem for us and a structural problem for us. And whilst it's often said that politics is won in the centre, you certainly can't reach out to swing voters, you can't reach out to the centre ground without a strong support base. And in fact, fundamentally, politics is often a debate about the centre. It is different mass movements when it comes to the major parties who have certain principles and ideals, and they put their views to the Australian people and they try and convince them and bring them with them. Not every policy that's ever put forward, or every leader, in fact, who's initially put forward would always have majority support. I look to the Howard era. Many of the policies that were implemented, if you'd said to people, do you want a GST, which we did in an election, it was pretty difficult to bring them on board, but we still have that. We have policies that were argued for over a period of time.
OK, just a quick one. Did you see the internal Liberal Party polling Malcolm Turnbull referred to, said the whole party room had seen it, which he said showed that in 40 marginal seats, Turnbull was ahead, or the government was ahead by 4 points?
No, I didn't. And when it comes to, you know, would
that have made a difference had you seen it?
Well, look, you know, I made my judgments based on a range of factors, and opinion polls are interesting, and certainly we pay attention to opinion polls, but we also look at a whole range of other things, including how we do at the actual ballot box. And one of the real concerns that was around at the time, and I expressed this at the time as well, that when we put ourselves to the people in places like Longman, a place where we would expect to win most of the time or much of the time, and our support was under 30%, that gave you a bit of an indicator of many of our traditional supporters who are no longer supporting.
OK, June Mara, questioner had a hand up. Go ahead.
It's been suggested that the recent by-election in Wentworth shows that the support in that area is actually to a more of a moderate Liberal stance, with independent Karen Phelps coming. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I guess the first thing I'd say to that is that there's a very big difference, a very stark difference between a seat like Wentworth and a seat like Longman. They are very, very different seats with very different constituencies where the issues that appeal will be quite different. There's no doubt about that. And so if you look at the kind of seats that we have to win in our traditional supporter base, which is particularly outer suburban and regional Australia, I would say that places like Longman are a lot more similar or a lot more representative of the kind of seats that decide elections, and certainly where, middle Australia is. So yes, Wentworth is a particular example, and it was a difficult situation in terms of losing that seat. But if you look at Wentworth, I would put to you that Wentworth is not necessarily indicative of what's going on in the rest of the country.
All right, we'll go to another question on the same topic, and then we'll go around the panel. The next question is from Jamie Clark.
Thanks, Tony. What does the panel think ScoMo needs to do to regain the trust of the Liberal voters, or has the damage already been done?
Parnell, McGuinness, start with you.
Well, I think to begin with, the most important thing is to define a vision for where Australia is going. I think one of the reasons that we saw the votes tailing off at the end of the Wentworth election is because it looked like the government was becoming too tactical on certain issues, right or wrongly. And what was not clear was where it was planning to take the Australian people. So people don't want to go talking about big philosophical ideas all the time, but I do feel like they do want to know that there is a clear direction that the government is taking, which is going to improve their lives and the lives of their children. And what happened in the case of the election of the Wentworth by-election, and what's also been happening a little bit since, is that whenever the government looks like it is just caving into what people want, it's punished in the polls. So that's the trend that I think I'm seeing. But
So you think people wanted an embassy in Jerusalem? Is that, for example?
Look, I think that you could have argued for that, but you would have had to argue for it within a philosophical construct. You can't argue for it within a momentary tactical discussion. So
right, which is what it appeared to be, a kind of
right.
tactical move for an electorate with a lot of Jewish people.
Exactly. And similarly, I mean, there have been moments since. So whenever the government moves away from the broad point of what a Liberal government is there to do, which is in many ways to set the course for growth and sometimes to argue the hard points, to get those through to ensure that the country is on the right path and that the future is secured for people, but more importantly for their children, because people will make sacrifices for their children as long as they know that the country is headed in the right direction on those things. And they get very upset when they feel like they are being pandered to, or when things are being decided on a very small scale sort of level, because that means that they're being betrayed, being sold out on a big picture.
Chris Bowen, and I suppose the obvious question is, should Bill Shorten be getting on a bus and travelling through Queensland, or at least flying half the way?
Well,
exactly. Part of the way?
If you're going to do a bus tour, make it a bus tour, is lesson one. But I think in all seriousness, I think what Zed's answer underlined was that actually there's a battle going on for the heart and soul of the Liberal Party. I mean, Zed's answer actually, to his credit, confirmed it wasn't actually about the election and who was going to give them a better chance of winning the election. It was about what sort of government. I was giving you some credit, Zed, but it's about what sort of government they're going to be. Are they a Liberal government or a Conservative government? There's this huge battle going on for the Liberal Party, and that's why this government is frankly so dysfunctional. I mean, we can't actually even have an energy policy as a country, because there's a significant part of the governing party which doesn't believe that climate change is real or human-induced, and therefore we shouldn't have a policy to deal with it. And they have power of veto over the country's energy policy at the moment. That's the big problem at the heart of this government, just how dysfunctional they've become. And it's not just about issues of the day or who's more popular or personalities. There's actually a big battle going on. This disunity is real, and it's real on big issues, big things for the country, which the country should have a view on, the government of the day should certainly have a view on, but they are so riven with ideological conflict between small L Liberals and Conservatives that they simply haven't been able to settle on a governing approach for the country.
Quick one, tactically, would the Labor Party have been more pleased, if you like, to go to an election against Malcolm Turnbull or Scott Morrison, who does seem to be reaching out to the grassroots?
Well, look, in all seriousness, Tony, I understand the question, but, you know, of course we had those discussions while it was all going on. We were observers, and at one point I said, well, it's completely out of our hands. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And whoever the leader of the Liberal Party is, whoever the Prime Minister of the day is, we will fall back on a policy. I mean, we've spent 5 years developing an alternative policy for the country. That's what we've been doing, knowing full well, as we've done that that whichever Prime Minister or Treasurer we were facing on a particular day may well not be the Treasurer and Prime Minister we were facing on election day. But our policy hasn't changed. Our policy approach hasn't changed. We're the most robust policy offering any opposition's had in 25 years, most detailed policy, because that's what we want to actually fight the election on. And whether it was facing Malcolm Turnbull, Scott Morrison, Julie Bishop, the fundamentals of what we take to the people will be the same.
John Anderson, things were a lot more stable, as I mentioned at the beginning, in your day. How does this look, the rotating Prime Minister scenario, now in the Labor Party and the Liberal Party?
Well, Tony, the last question went to the issue of how ScoMo rebuilds trust.
Yeah.
And I actually think trust is the heart of the matter here. The research, including from ANU, which doesn't particularly want you to understand Western culture, but it's not bad with its political numbers, shows that the level of distrust in the system generally, but particularly in politicians and government in Australia, is at record high levels, and the level of trust is at record low levels. In a free, democratic society like ours, when trust breaks down, you're in trouble. And furthermore, we're polarised as never before in the Australian community. And this really worries me, because I have never known a time when we seem so intent upon flogging ourselves to death over domestic issues, like a bunch of dogs having a brawl, when there's several 800-pound gorillas coming over the horizon, which are quite blind to where we stand on some of these domestic brawls and whether we come from Queensland or Tasmania or Western Australia. The fact is that sooner or later, probably sooner, there will be another economic downturn. We are not as well prepared this time as we were last time. If we're not very careful, it will hurt. We should be sandbagging ourselves lest we end up in the sort of economic mess that a lot of European countries are in. And the other thing is it's had remarkably little attention. I've never known a time when Australians are as disinterested in the world that we live in as they are now. But not only have we got a trade war happening in America, you've got a multipolar world in general with many trouble spots, any of which could explode and create real difficulties for Australia, whether inadvertently or not. And the Vice President of the United States has effectively declared a new Cold War. We seem to be asleep at the wheel on a range of issues which go to the very heart of our securing our future in this tremendous country.
Let me just ask you this to go back to the questions that we started with, because we'll come back to this polarisation that you're talking about, the atomisation of politics. But is trust broken with the public when the party itself gets rid of a Prime Minister? It happened twice in the Liberal Party, it happened twice in the Labor government.
It doesn't help. The research shows that. You can see it. ANU's done some valuable work on it. There used to be a time when a tired government was replaced. It happened in 1996, it happened in 2007. There's a great surge in confidence. People think, terrific, this bunch, we've got a fresh bunch. They're interested in us, not themselves. It dissipates away, but since 2013, showing my age, Tony, since 2013, every election has just got worse. I hate to tell you, Chris, but the research would suggest that even if you blokes win, there'll be no great surge of confidence and trust on the part of the Australian people. Can I just say to you as an Australian, we have to break the cycle. We have to learn to talk to one another and listen to one another again and recognise that there are a lot of issues that confront the country that are blind to where we stand on some of the things we're tearing ourselves apart on at the moment.
We'll come back to some of these issues. Gillian Triggs, on the issues we're talking about, ScoMo, as he's referred to by the questioner, can he regain the people's trust, having taken the Prime Ministership in the way that he did?
Well, I think each time we've had a change of Prime Minister, there's been a surge of hope. I think Australians are looking for a leader of integrity. But I think in each case we've found within weeks that longing for leadership of integrity has dissipated. We've already been disappointed. And I think that's starting to affect people now. They're saying, well, we don't see where we're going to go now. We've tried everything. We've tried different parties. We're splintering. We've lost faith. We've lost trust. We see in a Wentworth election that we have policy made on the run. Even I think the members of the Jewish community were prepared to say, well, whatever the arguments are for moving the embassy, we don't like it to be announced in this way. We want it to be a properly considered policy that's been weighed and considered in Canberra, maybe public views sought on the matter within Wentworth and a policy announced. But I think, so is it possible for Scott Morrison to resume the mantle as leader and Prime Minister? It's not impossible, but I think at the moment this sort of bizarre environment of different baseball caps and pretending to eating meat pies. I think Australians are simply underestimated by too many of our political leaders. I've been doing a lot of speaking around the country in the last 18 months, and I really think we have an Australian public educated, looking for some answers and looking for leadership. And they're not going to be fooled by a bus that the Prime Minister's not actually travelling in, pictures of him eating meat pies and talking to farmers with baseball caps. I think we're much more sophisticated than that. We're really looking for, I think, integrity and as has been pointed out, a vision for the future. But also, I fully agree that there are some major issues coming down the track at us, in particular trade, but wider questions of cybersecurity, regional issues, that we're simply ignoring in favour of local issues.
Zed, you obviously get a right of reply there. Can ScoMo win back the public is really what the question is. And look at today's news poll, slid even further behind, now a 10-point difference between the two parties.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. One, yes, he can.
Will Peter Dutton have done better in this regard?
Well, let me just answer the question, because even if you look at also today, you've got polls in Queensland showing a recovery. Perhaps not coincidentally, the fact that Scott Morrison has been on the ground, electorate by electorate, community by community, and I disagree.
So the polls are showing a recovery?
Well, the Courier Mail poll today in Queensland showed...
So you care about that poll?
I never said that I don't care about polls. But it doesn't drive every decision I take, Tony. It doesn't drive every decision I take. There are things called principles and values in politics, and yes, the polls are important, but they are not everything.
Is the poll in the news poll? Well,
possible for me to finish?
Sure, but
I've had a couple of goes.
Is the news poll as significant as the Courier Mail poll?
Well, they're all significant. But look, I'm a student of political history, and there is a thing, and we saw it during the Howard era. In 98, in 2000, in 2004, the polls between elections seem to always show that the Liberal Party are about to be wiped off the face of the planet. And yet, in the Howard era, what happened at elections was quite different from what the polls were showing in the middle. They tightened, people focused on policy issues as they came closer to the election. That's what Scott Morrison is doing. And I disagree with Gillian's characterisation that there's something wrong with showing a bit of who you are. Scott Morrison does like a meat pie, does like watching footy, does like his beloved Sharks, is a family man, is very comfortable in those communities in suburban and regional Australia. I don't think that's anything to be ashamed of, and I don't think he's pretending to be any of that. I think that's actually who he is. And I think it's possible to have vision, as he has demonstrated as Treasurer and in border protection and as Prime Minister, but also be someone who connects with large swathes of the Australian electorate. I don't think that those two are mutually exclusive.
OK, you're watching Q&A Live. Our next question comes from Lydia Zhao.
Thanks, Tony. So my question is to Gillian Triggs regarding the recent cases of sexual harassment claims we've seen. So where do we draw the line between respecting the privacy and wishes of women who don't want their complaints to be made public, while at the same time encouraging women to speak out about sexual harassment without fear of humiliation and media scrutiny?
Well, thank you, Lydia. I think that is very much a question for today, given the Four Corners programme we've just seen. But I'd like to put my answer in a broader context, because we're really talking about a global phenomenon. And I should declare a particular interest. At the moment, I'm chairing a United Nations panel looking at abuse of office and harassment and sexual harassment within a United Nations body. What I'm trying to say to you is that this is an issue of women speaking up, the Me Too movement, obviously, that has grasped the public's attention at a global level. And we have a fundamental problem of, if you speak up, women tend to be victimised twice, at least. They suffer all sorts of problems. And that is why we have figures, both from our own research at the Australian Human Rights Commission and globally, that probably as few as 1 in 10 or even 1 in 20 will ever report an incident of sexual harassment or harassment. Now, the key question for us to ask is, why is that happening? And one reason is this risk of being demonised even further, and we see this in many, many instances. And I come back again and again to my experience at the Human Rights Commission. When matters came to the Commission, and hundreds a year we would resolve them quietly in the small rooms at the Commission, bringing in perhaps an executive of a major company, and you would get a face-to-face examination of the issue, and you would have the matter, in 76% of cases, informal complaints, we would resolve the matter quietly and confidentially. But once you bring it into the public arena, then you almost inevitably lose your ability to settle the matter, and women almost always come out second or third best.
Gillian, you mentioned the Four Corners program. Those in the audience here won't have seen it, but the broader audience, many of them will have. We've seen effectively that the ABC is facing its own Me Too moment, with the former managing director accusing the former ABC chair of improper conduct. Now, how should corporate boards handle, because we saw in detail how it was handled by the ABC board, how should corporate boards handle situations like this?
Well, corporate boards clearly have a responsibility to deal directly with the matter. It's a health and safety issue at minimum, but it's also an environment in which there's huge risk to the organisation, to the ability to carry out its objectives. Directors are responsible. And I should say that this is not necessarily dependent on a formal complaint. It's very common for directors of boards in the public or private sector to be well aware that these allegations are being made. But typically, they are unsubstantiated under particular legal processes. But boards, through staff association surveys, through the gossip mill, will very often be aware that this is going on. And what I'd suggest is that we now need much more stringent processes by which directors accept responsibility for taking these matters up and dealing with them. Most importantly, and I do go back to my experience with the Human Rights Commission, it must be a safe and confidential environment for women. If they feel that their allegations are going to be put into the media or by a competitive politician, they're not going to do it. We know they're not going to do it. So it's key that we establish safe, confidential environments, possibly external to the organisation, where these issues can be safely considered.
Hard to do analysis on the run because we've only just seen the program, but I think I'm right in saying Michelle Guthrie did alert the board to allegation, but initially didn't want the matter investigated. That changed over time, and particularly at the time that the board moved to sack her. Is that sort of, does that ring bells? Does that sort of thing sometimes happen?
It's absolutely typical. In other words, the woman concerned will raise the issue at particular levels, perhaps test the waters, see what kind of response she's getting, and very rapidly retreat and not make a formal complaint. And my understanding, and we've only just seen this report by Sarah Ferguson, but it appears that the point was made and then a formal complaint was not made. And that is typical globally. Women simply don't proceed because they see it as too dangerous, because they know as a very high probability that they will be the ones that suffer.
And we should make the absolutely clear point here that Justin Milne completely denies all of this, and we should get that on the record in this discussion. Parnell, I guess you saw some of it as well. We can take the broader question as well, but it's incredibly difficult to talk too much about the Four Corners issue, but it is a bit shocking, I think.
Of course, and we keep on hearing these kind of things at the moment, and of course, you know, the right of a woman to define how her career is seen, and not to let her career be defined by the bad behaviour of somebody else, I think has got to be paramount in these sort of situations. It's really important.
Speaking generally in this case.
Speaking very generally, speaking of all of the times when women have not come forward or chosen not to report or chosen not to make a formal complaint out of things, there is a reason why they do that, and that is because they don't want their careers defined by these things. Also, though, in all of these sort of matters, it is important to think about what the effects are on both men and women, because there are effects of on men of this. There are occasions on which allegations are falsely levelled against men, and I think it is a really important moment to consider both of those sides of the debate. We cannot be having this discussion about women ignoring what happens to men when allegations are raised that are false. That is not in any way, in any circumstance, to imply that a woman is not telling the truth. But there have been cases, most notably in the States recently, with some football players who had their careers ruined on the basis of a fake rape allegation, that go beyond the pale. And so it's really important that this debate be about both genders and how they're interacting, and how we can ensure that one side's attempt at being able to speak out more doesn't become a way of oppressing the other side.
Zed, well, actually, you want to jump in and I'll go to Zed after that.
Well, I wanted to agree, but perhaps also to raise these other points, that to make allegations in the public arena, although the Me Too campaign and this global awareness of this issue has been important in some respects, one of my concerns as a lawyer is that far too many of the men have no natural justice, no ability to defend themselves. They're simply resigning, and then they're using the tool of defamation to come back against the woman concerned. Now, arguably, that could be a misuse of the device of defamation laws as they exist in Australia. But at the same time, for those men, if they feel that they've been unjustly accused, they have no other option. They have no other vehicle, because they've been accused in a public arena. They've lost that most important characteristic of their reputation with their colleagues. They've also lost their job very often, and they have no other option. So that brings me back to the point that I think, certainly taking up your point, that we have to look at this from both perspectives, but we need to understand that we cannot solve this problem in the public arena. We really need safe, confidential and private ways in which to resolve matters long before we go anywhere near the courts, by which time, of course, the matter is way out in the public arena.
Seselja.
Well, look, I think a number of very good points there from Gillian and Parnell. I think that some of the cases, and I won't even comment on the particular cases, but a couple of the cases that have been high profile at the moment have been very harrowing, I think, for everyone involved, but particularly for some of the women who have been, giving evidence, having to effectively be, have their integrity questioned, and, God knows what that's like to experience that, particularly if there are genuine, cases of sexual assault or harassment. We, even in the ACT, have been wrestling with this in our local assembly on this, and very hard to find that answer with what Gillian is trying to find there, but this is in the criminal arena, where draft laws have been put forward to make it easier for women to come forward, which is very good and noble, but then the Law Society and others have come back and said, well, what about due process, and how do we ensure that someone gets a fair trial? That's in the extreme in criminal cases, but as Gillian's pointed out, reputations can be ruined. But we are seeing that it is very, very difficult for women to speak out. So we need cultural change where, firstly, less of this goes on, particularly in workplaces and other things, and it's stamped out, that we have zero tolerance for it. And then where there are those transgressions or alleged transgressions, we do need to find some processes where it can be fair to both sides.
All right, Chris Bard.
Well, it's hard to disagree with anything that's been said. And to get to the nub of your question, you said, where's the line? Well, the views of the woman involved must be respected and protected if she doesn't want it taken further publicly. That is the key fundamental point. And if she does want it taken further, it must be very thoroughly investigated, and no hesitation should be applied in ensuring justice occurs. It's in one level complicated, but on another level very simple.
John Edison.
Yeah, look, I think it goes to the issue of trust again. Whenever two or more are gathered, trust becomes a central issue in a relationship, doesn't it? And if two people can trust one another, or a group of people can trust each other, you can go together, flourish together. If they can't, then people flee for the rule book. And it's appalling that trust can be broken so easily, it seems, by people who are prepared to harass others sexually. And those responsible have now bought a Me Too movement, which is in one sense, I have to say, understandable, but which runs the real danger.
You mean brought on one, caused it to happen?
Yeah, I think those who are responsible for sexual harassment have brought this on us.
Yeah.
And I think you've actually seen it already backfire in America. It did in the Kavanagh case. It backfired. I mean, the accusations, you had two of the people who complained now have withdrawn and said that it never happened, you know, which is disgraceful. So it's actually been counter to the whole objective, I think, of highlighting this issue and looking for justice. And the other point I'd just make, though, that really does concern me out of this, is that as we go forward, we need to, I think, focus on the issue of trust. We've got to rebuild trust. We don't want a situation where innocent people can have their entire reputation and future life ruined because they were seen as guilty before innocent. The emphasis on truth was reversed. On the other hand, absolutely, women should feel safe. They should feel able to trust those around them. And we need to make certain that whatever we do builds trust. But the other point that I'd make to Gillian, and I've thought about this quite a bit, is that what really troubles me with all of this machinery, and I'm one of those people who regrets that it's necessary, frankly, and I don't like a lot of the machinery that now exists, so I'll be frank about that. But what it seems to me, though, we've all been overtaken by something we didn't foresee, which is the massive power of social media and the modern platforms for us to harass others, including sexually, in ways that we don't even know how to begin to appeal to people to stop using their freedoms as licence. You want to lose your freedoms, exercise them as licence, and everybody will go for the rule book, and we all fall behind.
Let's move on. Our next question is from Samuel Aragone.
My question goes exactly to what you just said. We've just had many terrorist attacks perpetrated by obviously mentally disturbed individuals, radicalised by social media. If you remember the start of that ISIS and the stuff we were seeing on television. Now, while freedom of the press and to see that is fairly important, don't you think it's time for social media companies to restrict that sort of garbage, as they've done to right-wing politicians in America, and to restrict the obvious incitement of hatred and mass murder, because these insane attacks didn't exist anywhere in the world to this extent since the advent of the internet?
John, I'll take it first to you, since the questioner obviously has picked up on something you said. Do you think there should be restrictions on internet freedom in order to stop the radicalisation of certain people, and in this case, someone with what appears to be a mental illness?
I think it's an incredibly good question, and I think every one of us in this room needs to be worried about it. Having said that, I'm not sure I have the answer. See, the great problem is that if you let the platform providers censor, who knows where they will go with that censorship and who they will use it against and how they'll arrange their algorithms to distort the public debate. Because what the internet has really done, and social media has done, is to create a virtual global public square that we can all participate in. The only rough parallel in history for it is the advent of the printing press, if you stop and think about it. Ultimately, it produced a lot of good, but in the short term, it produced tremendous dislocation. That problem many millions of times over. I think we do need regulation, but I don't think you can let the companies who operate the platforms provide it. We can't
talk about government regulation?
I don't see who else can do it. It probably needs to be consistent across the globe. I don't like the idea of it. But if you stop and think about it, if you post a letter, unless it's got a bomb in it that's picked up somewhere by a metal detector, you expect your letter to go through. And if you make a telephone call, if you pay your money, unless you're inciting somebody and you're picked up by a security agency doing something really illegitimate, you expect it to go through. I actually think, given that they're information delivery channels, if you like, we want to be very careful about letting the platform deciders censor, and yet plainly we've got to be very careful about what's on them. This confronts particularly young people. And some of you might have been victims of bullying on this sort of thing. I think that's absolutely horrific. How do we find the light-handed but powerful enough regulatory influence to try and get the balance right here so that we can make this rudimentary public square, the great concept in principle that we can all participate in it, work to build cooperation and build trust and starve those of ill intent of oxygen? It's a very good question. I don't have a neat answer, but we sure as heck need to focus on it.
Chris Bowen, well, there was a call from a former Deputy Prime Minister essentially to censor some aspects of internet use and for the government to be involved.
Well, there's no doubt that there's an obligation on the platform providers to show social responsibility, whether you call it censorship or good management. There's no doubt about that. And there's no doubt there's a role for government as well. John raised the matter of bullying, which is a separate matter, but it's a very legitimate matter for him to raise. And, you know, this government has an e-safety commissioner, which is doing good work and really working with the community, with the providers to try and manage better some of these things, because the issue you raise is very valid, getting back to terrorism and terror-inspired acts. Yes, I mean, many of the people, without commenting on any particular investigations at the moment, many of the people involved have no direct personal links with the broader bodies, but they're inspired through social media. And our intelligence agencies have a good deal of work before them tracking that, because it is like a needle in a haystack in many instances across the entire...
Okay, we're going to have to ask our questions to make their answers a little briefer so we get through more questions. Gillian Triggs, and the Prime Minister on this issue of the mental illness, the Prime Minister brought in on this today, said there can be no excuses, the man's a terrorist.
Well, I think that's a most unhelpful approach. The perpetrator intended to terrorise, that meets a definition of terrorism, I can accept that. But what I think is deeply worrying is that in so many of these instances of terrorist acts in Australia designed to terrorise, they've been by people with profound mental disturbance and or drug abuse, or substance abuse of one kind or another. And I think to ignore that reality is very foolish indeed. We really need, and I think that it's a broader question, but I think we need to work with our communities more closely. We need more support for our families. Most importantly, we need more support for those with mental illness. We need to pick them up, work with them, make sure that they're getting the support. And it might be that we can help them avoid these great extremes of paranoid behaviour or whatever happens when they have these episodes. That it's impossible for the security agencies to predict when somebody's going to go off the rails in the way that that we've been seeing recently. And maybe it's stimulated in part by social media, I don't know. But I think that to ignore this phenomenon of mental illness fuelled by drug abuse and to say it's purely an ideological terrorist attack is a very unhelpful comment, because it diverts us from those kinds of inquiries that we need to make.
Seselja, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I disagree. I think the Prime Minister is calling it as he sees it, and I think that the vast majority of Australians would agree. This was an act of terror. It met clearly the definition in terms of the inspiration, the motivation and the effect. And, you know, obviously in terms of Burke Street, our hearts go out to the victims, their families. You know, one person's lost their life as well as the terrorist, but also a number of other people have been injured or traumatised quite severely. So I don't think it's in any way, in fact, I think it's absolutely right for the Prime Minister to call this for what it is. I think the Australian people expect no less. You call out terrorism when you see it. We deal with it in all sorts of ways. We deal with it at a security level, we deal with it at a policing level, we deal with it, of course, in de-radicalisation and try and get in front of it where there are people at risk of radicalisation. We try and pull every lever we possibly can to keep Australians safe, but I don't think much is gained from not calling a spade when it comes to this.
OK, let's move on. We've got another question from Priscilla Curran.
Yes, thank you. My question is to Gillian Triggs. I note that you have called on Labor to support the government's bill to send refugees from Manus Island and Nauru to New Zealand on the condition that they be banned from ever coming to Australia. Yet you have also stated that this is not a choice you would ever want to make at a moral level. How do you balance your own moral code and ethical concerns with the pragmatism of policy?
Well, Priscilla, thank you. This has troubled me. This is a wicked problem. It's a Sophie's choice. what I'm most disturbed by is that we have a government holding the lives of these children and their families to ransom in order to get legislation through that would ensure, mind you, that legislation bill rather has been around for quite some time, but to force it through so that we can have a ban on all those who've arrived without a valid visa as a maritime arrival. I think that it's a wicked problem to hold the lives of these children and their families to ransom. And that is why I took when the issue was being mooted, and we haven't heard very much about it in the last 2 or 3 weeks, but when it was being mooted, I made and I'm merely a private citizen, my view is no more important than anybody else's, but my personal view is that I would never want to stand in the way of releasing these children and their families who've now been on Nauru for 5.5 years.
So what we're talking about here specifically is numbers of the children going to New Zealand, possibly their parents too, but never being able to come to Australia, and that should be legislated. You would agree to that legislation as a compromise?
Well, I would. And it's unclear exactly as to whether it would apply, that ban, that total ban, would apply to others on Manus Island, the 600 or 700 men, or others in Australia. In other words, we don't yet know what that bill would require. But the parents would go with them. There's a special problem with New Zealand, of course. Well, it's not a problem. We have, of course, closer economic relations, and you can move freely. And that is why that's always been seen as an impediment to accepting the New Zealand offer. But my position, and I am being pragmatic, and you're right to ask the question, you know, how do you balance pragmatism with a point of principle? Both positions are wrong, both morally and legally. Holding children indefinitely in indefinite immigration detention is illegal in international law. We've just been criticised yet again by the Human Rights Council.
Gillian, I've got to go around the other panellists. So...
OK, I'm very sorry. But to wrap up then, I think government bills and government policies can change very, very quickly. We cannot, I think, hold these children in detention for any longer. And if New Zealand will offer them an opportunity for a future, I think we have to accept it.
Now, Chris Bowen, where's Labor on this now? Because obviously it's a critical for your support.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have said, firstly, we don't like that bill, that legislation, one little bit. It bans any person who's come to Australia by boat from ever travelling to Australia as a tourist, if they go on to be business people or elected to Parliament. We don't like it one little bit. But we have actually said, to get it done, we would support it if it applied only to New Zealand, which is the matter which Gillian correctly raises about free movement. We don't like it, but to get the New Zealand offer accepted, which it should have been accepted years ago, but to get it accepted, we would vote for the legislation if it only applies to those who go to New Zealand. It is a complete false choice that the government is putting on the Parliament and the people. There is absolutely no link between the legislation and accepting the New Zealand offer. But they've made the link, and we accept that. That's the world we have to live in, so we would vote for it. We wrote to the government, and they've completely rejected it.
So tell us what it is you'd vote for. Would you vote for a permanent ban on any of those people ever coming to Australia?
Those who go to New Zealand.
What about their children?
Well, that's the legislation before us, is that anybody who gets transferred to New Zealand, or anywhere else for that matter, in the government's proposed legislation, would be banned from ever coming to Australia. As I said, we don't like that one little bit.
Multi-generational or...?
No, as I understand it, it applies only to those people who are physically transferred.
Yep.
Now, the government has rejected that offer. Now, they sent the signal just before the Wentworth by-election that they'd be open to conversations to make the New Zealand offer work. And as soon as the Wentworth by-election was over, they shut down that conversation.
OK, I'm going to take it straight to Seselja. Is the offer still on the table? If Labor agrees to this legislation, will you act, not just talk about it?
Well, look, I'm not going to, on behalf of the Home Affairs Minister, negotiate here in terms of legislation. He's set out the government's position. He's set it out very clearly and for very good reason in terms of dealing with the people smuggling trade. Now, we don't want to see a situation where there are more kids coming or more kids drowning at sea, as there were previously under the Labor administration.
Zed, we know you can't make the legislation. You can't do that yourself, but would you support legislation with the Labor support to do what Labor and Gillian Triggs are now saying is a compromise to get those children and their parents off Nauru?
Well, as I said, Peter Dutton's set out a position. It's not up to me to negotiate on his behalf.
I'm asking, would you support it?
Well, as
this idea.
But you're asking me as a member of the government, and I'm not going to sit here when there is these discussions that Peter Dutton has set out the government's position. If that were to change, that would be a matter for Peter Dutton.
Parnell, what do you think about this?
I find it really, really sad that over the last period we've been playing so much politics with an issue like this. It really cuts me to the quick that there are children on Nauru still because both sides of politics, all sides of politics, are still haggling over who is going to look best if they behave in a certain way. Chris, in your book, Hearts and Minds, you wrote about the tragedy of being Immigration Minister, about how tough it was to look at the memorial of Civ 10 and how hard that was to see that children had died in this process of being brought to Australia and that could never happen again. And yet, over the last 5 years, all we have seen is the Labor Party saying that it's the government's rigorous policy which is at fault, and the Liberal Party trying to move children off, which they did under Howard previously. I mean, let's not forget that the children had all been moved out of detention under Howard following the Seselja review. They had been quietly brought in. Now, it's not just the Labor Party's fault that that didn't happen over the last 5 years. There was a lot of activist work around that space which constantly brought the plight of these children into the limelight, but then stopped them through this activist work, stopped them being brought out of the detention camps quietly without restarting.
Parnell, you've raised a series of things. I think Chris Bowen has a right to reply to that.
I just don't see how you can say that, given I've just said on behalf of the Labor Party, we're prepared to work with the government to vote for legislation we don't actually like to get it done. I mean, I just don't see how your argument has any water.
It's been opportunities and opportunities.
Well, here we are. We said weeks ago we would do this. The government only made this link recently. I mean, the New Zealand offer has been on the table for years. The legislation's been in the Parliament for years. They've never previously been linked. When the government just linked them out of the blue recently and said we're not going to take the New Zealand offer unless this legislation passes, we had to consider that. We said, all right, we'll vote for that legislation if it applies only to New Zealand. That's a very, frankly, big offer from us to get it done, because it's, we shouldn't be arguing about this. The New Zealand offer should be accepted. There's an offer from a country there to help get the people off Nauru. The government's made a false link to legislation, which is completely irrelevant in our view, but to get it done and put this issue behind us and stop the politics of it, we are prepared to do that. So I don't see how you can say it's all sides' fault, all sides are playing politics. We are making that offer. The government is not... Zed said I can't be involved in the negotiations. There are no negotiations. There are no discussions. The government's not talking to us. They don't want our support that we've offered in writing to vote for the legislation to get the New Zealand offer accepted.
I'm going to bring in John Anderson here because, as Parnell pointed out, your government did actually work out a way to quietly bring all the people out of offshore detention. Obviously, there's an opportunity to do it here. Should it happen?
Well, look, the point is that the people smugglers were put out of business. The drownings at sea stopped. They started again, and those children are there now because the Labor Party opened the way for people smugglers to get back into business. That's the blunt reality of this. And I say to you, I mean, I like everybody else, I'm deeply troubled by what happens to children. I mean, I'm horrified at what still happens in parts of this very state, let alone the country.
So should the government and the Labor Party make a deal, create this legislation, which means they would never come to Australia, and allow them to be taken off Nauru?
The objective is quite a clear one, is to make sure that there aren't more children tomorrow back in Nauru or places like it because the people smugglers go back to business. And let me make one other point. There's a little tad of sort of virtue signalling coming at us from our friends across the Tasman at the moment. We take 4 times the number of refugees in real need per capita than New Zealand does.
OK, we've got... very briefly.
Very briefly.
Yep.
I really have to take the point that that's been made by both participants, but was also made by the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull on a Q&A last week. This is the repetition of a false binary, that you need to hold the children and their families on Nauru indefinitely in order to stop the boats and stop the drownings at sea. That is a false argument. And
think that might be
wrong. Okay.
I think it might be a place to leave it. Thank you very much. The
Well,
next
if this
question.
is mishandled, you will have them back again. That's a simple matter.
We have
of
an
reality.
armada of ships that are stopping them.
Okay.
The votes.
All right. The next question comes from Rohan Hora.
Mark Latham has officially joined One Nation and is campaigning on platforms including selective migration and political correctness, issues which continue to splinter and polarise society. Do you believe that Australian society is becoming more and more politically fractured? And if so, how do we start bringing people back together?
I'm going to start with Parnell. What do you think about that?
Well, he's tried out almost every other party in Australia so far and they haven't fit. So let's see how it goes with this. Look, my simple thought would be I'm also concerned about this sort of fracturing. I'm also concerned about this kind of whipping people up into extreme populist positions, which I don't think is helpful at all, because it's not really a philosophical position. It's not really an attempt at taking the country forward. It's really appealing to the concerns people have without offering a solution, sort of getting them riled up about the worst things that are going on. And I think that that's sort of partly the problem that we're having in politics now, is that there are the philosophical arms of the parties which are debating with one another, and then there are the sort of culture wars parts of the parties which are debating with one another. And One Nation is a culture war party without a plan for the country, and to have a party like that leading the debate means that we all go off talking about the wrong things and neglect the things which are really going to be important for Australia's future.
Chris Bowen, a Labor leader joining One Nation. First of all, no, actually, seriously, does it hurt? Because here's a man you chose to be Prime Minister, or to run for Prime Minister against.
Well, I think we worked out a long time ago that was a very big mistake, frankly. And he makes that point for us every time he appears in public. Yes, we made a mistake.
You think you're lucky stars he never did become Prime Minister?
Well, clearly. Look, in fairness, I mean, he has contributed at various points to the public debate in a constructive way. I mean, he's had ideas, he's written books, he's been constructive, but clearly he's also contributed, for want of a better word, in a very destructive fashion more recently. And that's a shame, because he's not without intellect, he's not without some ability, but clearly he has a very different view of his place in the Australian body politic than we do, and that most people do. To answer your question, yes, we are more polarised, we're more fractured, we're more tribal. That's not just us, though. That is happening around the world. We're seeing it everywhere, perhaps most starkly in the United States, but also in Europe. If you look at the results in this week's election in the United States, I mean, one side took the House, which is a voting system which reflects population. The other side took the Senate in a system which spreads the votes across, which basically means one side has dominated rural areas, smaller towns. And I read an article today, I think it was 10 years ago, I might have that not quite right, but there were 17 states where a US senator came from different parties. They have 2 senators per state. There were 17 states where one was a Democrat, one was a Republican. Now there's only 7 states where that's the case. They're completely polarised and fractured. Now, we don't have time to go through all the reasons of that. Social media is playing a role in that. You get your views reinforced more and more. You get your news from outlets or social media platforms which reinforce your views, don't challenge your views. You go to areas of social media which tell you what you want to hear and which make you more tribal, frankly. And that's happening around the world. I think our media is more tribal as well, promoting one point of view and fighting each other about that. You know, the various parts of the media saying the other part of the media aren't engaging in accurate reporting. It's always been a bit of a factor, but it's much more common now than it once was.
We're on a clock, Chris.
Sure.
John Anderson, this actually was where you almost started your conversation with us. So what do you think about that?
Look, this atomisation really worries me. David Brooks, who writes for the New York Times, wrote back in January this year that, in his view, 60 years of narcissism and of atomisation, tribalisation in the American culture has now presented the problem where you can't get policy resolution on the major issues confronting the country because no one can agree on the things we have in common. And in that sense, I think he would argue, and I think he's right, I don't want to put words in his mouth, that Trump in many ways is the product of that polarisation and of that disagreement. And I think it's happening here too. But let me tell you what I think is particularly dangerous and worrying about it. It's the moral judgments we now make on people that we disagree with. We didn't do that in the old days. You know, many of the most notorious characters in our history, the greats, disagreed vehemently on things and enjoyed doing it and came away respecting one another. We don't seem to be able to do that anymore. In fact, to go to another American to sort of hack Martin Luther King, I look forward to the day when my children are judged on the basis of their character, not where they sit on the politically hot-button issue of the day. We have got to learn to respect one another's dignity and place as fellow Australians. The genius of our freedom lies in our ability to disagree but not hate.
Zed.
It's hard to top that. I think that's an outstanding contribution from John. I think in terms of the ability not to hate each other, I think if you look inside the parliament, you would remember, John, in your time, there are plenty of examples of people being able to reach across the aisle. Maybe it doesn't happen as much as it used to, and I think it is important, because it is important that we can have dialogue with those who we disagree with, even vehemently disagree with. I think the point you made in your question, Rohan, around political correctness is an important one as well, because I think that is seen by many people as really stifling speech. It is stifling even a bit of, freedom of just being a larrikin, making a joke. Sometimes there's a little bit too much offence, and we need to be careful not to sort of over-regulate and overreact when people say something that we might think is a bit inappropriate or a little bit offensive. So there's a responsibility on all of us, but I think, to John's point, being able to reach across the aisle, being able to disagree and not hate one another is very, very important. I think there is more of that than perhaps is shown on the nightly news, because that is all about conflict, but there is no doubt we are heading in a direction where that is becoming less apparent.
Gillian, we'll jump over you because we're going to come back to you at the end, but I've got a question first of all from Lachlan Clark. Go, Lachlan.
Thanks, Tony. In light of recent media speculation that Barnaby Joyce is thinking of a political resurgence to the National Party, further destabilising the coalition and increasing the chance of a disastrous shortened government, what would your advice, John, be to National Party members, especially the bedwetters, like Zed, thinking of placing the dagger further into the government's chance of winning the next election against the most unpopular opposition leader in Australia's history?
John Anderson.
Everybody gets a go there.
Yeah, I'm afraid they do. But John Anderson, so Barnaby Joyce, I think the core of that is, if he were to come back, that would be very damaging for the coalition. What do you think?
Look, Barnaby is a man who I enormously appreciate his ability to put a case, I have to say, for rural Australians. But what has happened has happened. It can't be taken lightly. And I think it's incredibly important that we not send the message that white-handing of leaders has become part of the political norm in Australia. If we're to restore trust, we've got to put that behind us. Now, in this case, the reality is that Barnaby's actions led to a certain outcome. He needs to work those through at a personal level. They're big issues that he's now confronted with, and I feel for him in that. And I have to say, you've earned your spurs once, you've lost them, go and rebuild them. It's not going to happen overnight. And
certainly not before the coming election.
Certainly not before the coming election.
Chris Bowen, you get a right of reply because of the questioners, but keep it brief if you can.
Oh, no, I won't go to all the issues you raised. That's fair enough. But look, Barnaby Joyce is, in my view, my personal opinion, the most overrated politician in Australia. That's my view. And the fact that we're even having this conversation says something. I mean, 3 months after he lost the leadership, we're talking about him potentially coming back? That just underlines how dysfunctional this show is.
Now, Zed, that was a off-the-cuff remark about you being a bedwetter, and you certainly get a response to that.
I think at the start of the show I was being accused of ignoring the polls, and now you're suggesting I must have just been slavishly following them, I suspect. But look, in terms of the actual question, there's no doubt. Look, you know, it's a glib comment from Chris in terms of Barnaby. I think he has great talent. I think he's been a great advocate for regional Australia, and as John has pointed out, you know, through personal mistakes and personal issues, he no longer leads the National Party. That's a matter, no doubt, for him of great regret and for his family, and we all know about that. I think Michael McCormack is doing a great job. I think Barnaby will continue to contribute, and I don't think I think it's good to have big characters in Australian politics. We, you know, flawed characters. We've got lots of them,
but not leading the National Party.
Well, look, the National Party leadership, I'll leave that. I'll leave that absolutely to them. And John would be a much greater expert on those issues than I would.
OK. Got time for one last question. It's from Cindy Tan.
Thanks, Mr Jones. Human rights and anti-discrimination policy in Australia have been caught in the crossfire of race politics and religious debate. Islamophobia, xenophobic policies being tabled, and we've seen it on the floors of our parliament. For example, Fraser Anning's maiden speech. Proposals to amend Section 18C and more recently the defence of religious freedom in Catholic schools. Have we got the tools, and are we doing enough today to protect and future-proof harmony in Australia?
Gillian.
Thank you very much, Cindy. That's a big question, and I'm afraid the answer is that in Australia we do not have the legal tools to ensure protection of fundamental rights and freedoms. It's perhaps not understood within Australia that we are the only democracy in the world that does not have a charter or a Bill of Rights. And my experience as President of the Commission on the 18C issue, the Race Discrimination Act, the inadequacies of the Sex Discrimination Act, which allows discrimination on various grounds, particularly sexual orientation, all sorts of exceptions for religious beliefs. These are all in the Sex Discrimination Act. These are things that we need to discuss and we need to understand. Funnily enough, they've only come into the public arena because we've had a report from Mr Ruddock, I believe, given to the government in May, still not available to the public, and it's sort of leaking out. We don't really know exactly what it's saying, but basically it has shone a light on some of the inadequacies of our current legislation. So my immediate answer to you, and thank you for the question, is we do not have the tools in Australia for ensuring fundamental human rights, and I think we now need to think, as Queensland clearly is, about some form of legislated charter so that we give our courts the tools to ensure that we don't detain people indefinitely, that we do have mechanisms for ensuring what's above the line and what's below the line on sexual harassment, and what are the limits on freedom of speech, as this gentleman Samuel has raised earlier. So I think that's really where I've landed after my time at the Commission, and I now really do believe very strongly that as a nation we need to revisit what, of course, was considered by Father Frank Brennan some years ago in 2009.
OK, we'll hear from both the people who've retired from their senior positions. John Anderson, a Bill of Rights.
No, I'm sorry, I'm totally opposed to it. If you want to see a real problem, have a look at America, which has a Bill of Rights, which politicised its greatest court in the land. That's what they've done. It started making political decisions, so people started treating it like a political body. But they can't be voted out. The parliaments should be held responsible for these things. The courts should stick to interpreting the law. I'm against a Bill of Rights. I actually think we are. I don't think any country in the world, I'm not saying it's perfect, has ever written a better book on freedom than this country that I love so dearly, and I believe you do as well.
Yeah, have one.
And the machinery our forebears gave us are fully capable of protecting us, and I believe the parliaments are fully capable of acting responsibly to secure the freedoms that we need. I also think that the constitutional arrangements we have are second to none.
Well, we've certainly heard both sides of that argument. That's all we have time for tonight. We're over time. Please thank our panel: Seselja, Gillian Triggs, John Anderson, Chris Bowen and Parnell McGuinness. Next Monday on Q&A, here visiting from the United States, New Yorker correspondent and Trump watcher Susan Glasser, foreign editor for The Australian Greg Sheridan, chief political correspondent for the Saturday paper Karen Middleton, and two politicians to be announced. Till next Monday, good night.